But we are going on a road trip today. And so, since we are going on a road trip, we need a vehicle to travel in. And I brought some stuff with me this morning as we journey on this trip together. So I showed you this commercial because when I saw this commercial, I knew I had to show you guys this. Because this commercial that's done by Ram is literally called Ram Trust. They found this key thing that they kind of dialed in on that I think is actually pretty solid stuff. Here's what they say. Trust isn't built in a day, it's built over time. Early hours and late nights built by doing the work, pushing the limits every day. And the promises that we make are the promises that we are built to keep. I think those things are pretty good truths. How many know that when we trust God, that's a daily walk? It's something that we work on, right? Right? It is. And it's something that we have to get up and work hard at it every single day. And so I was thinking about those two ideas of trust and promises and our relationship to God and how that works with each one of us. And I began to think about one person from Scripture that just kind of popped out from the front. And that person is the name Abraham, right? We know Abraham is like this person of faith. We see him in the New Testament. He's one of the people in Hebrews that he's talked the most about. But Abraham is like the father of the promise, right? This great, big, huge promise that would be an overarching promise throughout all of Scripture. It was a promise to him, it was a promise to his children, and it's a promise to us that we can be grafted in by faith. That's awesome. But Abraham was this person who attained the promise by taking a leap of faith and trusting God. And because he chose faith, it says it was accounted to him for righteousness. And so there's this tension before we move forward at all, that what kind of person, along with faith, does it take to be able to grab hold of the kind of promises that God has for us? What kind of person, what does it take to be that kind of person? And so I'm reading this story, and so before we jump in to see Abraham's response and his life story, I want us to kind of take a pre-flight check. There's a couple of verses before you see Abraham kind of take flight in his road trip. And so I want us to kind of look at those just for a quick second. This is kind of the pre-flight check I think that we should look at in our own lives of what motivates us to do what we do. One of the things is I would suggest to you is don't exchange your future for your present. Abraham's father, Terah, took Abraham and his grandson Lot and his daughter-in-law, Sarah, the wife of Abraham, and together they set out from Ur, where they were living, of the Chaldeans, to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there, and he died in Haran. He had great intentions of going to Canaan, the place of promise, but he stopped halfway. And so I'm just going to throw out some observations because it's not written in the story, but I read some things when I'm reading this story and I'm thinking, and I'll just share them with you. Number one, what made him set out to Canaan? Was it something that God had already spoken to Abraham's father to just kind of head that way? When Abraham's father left to head toward Canaan, it says that he took Abraham and his wife, but he didn't take his other son, Nahor, and his wife. They stayed. Is it because he knew something more about Abraham? Or is it because Abraham was the first child born and that he would be the right to the inheritance? And so if you think about it, if they would have made it all the way to Canaan, he would have had an inheritance already in Canaan from his father. But for whatever reason, he stopped. He stopped halfway moving in the right direction. So one of the things I would challenge you in your motivation today is, where are you at when you're pursuing the promise? And if you're pursuing the promise of God, don't stop halfway when you're moving in the right direction. The second one is this: is don't settle for someone else's dream for your life. It really doesn't say a whole lot why he stopped. Maybe he stopped because the town's name was Haran, and his son that had passed away was also named Haran. Maybe he stopped there because it reminded him of his son and he liked that place that he was living in. Whatever the reason, he stayed there and he didn't move on, and his son Abraham stayed as well. I don't know if it was because that he was following his dad's dreams. Maybe he wanted to go someplace else. It doesn't say. But the reason I'm pointing this out is I have seen students over the year that were pressured and pressed to follow the dreams of the ones around them instead of putting God's dreams first. And specifically, I remember a student not that long ago who had graduated from high school who really didn't know what he was going to do. And as he was trying to figure out the process, his dad really kind of got more involved and said, well, if you're not going to do anything, you're going to do this. And so the son said, well, my dad did this. His dad did this. It's kind of in the family. I guess I will do this. I'm just telling you, if God isn't in that, that's not a good way to live. You got to make sure that whatever dreams you're pursuing and promises that you're pursuing, that God is the one that's leading. Here's another thing to consider. Don't discount God even when life appears less extraordinary. Think about this. Abraham had 0 pre-qualifiers listed in this story when God called him. He had nothing that reveals a devout life in service to God. Perhaps the only thing that I was thinking that he might have had is that when he looked out in all of creation, that he saw God and believed. But it doesn't say anything about his faith, about the kind of person, except he believed and he had ears to hear. And I will tell you, if all you have is belief, it's still the best platform to build a life on. But God is the initiator of the promise. Think about this. He is completely ordinary. Hold up your hand if you're ordinary. Hold up your hand if you're mortal, right? Hold up your hand if you're normal. Well, hopefully you can hold up your hand for that. I don't know. I got mine halfway up. I'm still thinking about it. I like this because there's no pre-qualifiers and God still calls him. That makes me feel like that in no matter what circumstance in my life, that God could still be calling each one of us to something greater. Because here's the reality. God is inviting us to a life-changing road trip, and it's up to us how we'll respond. So let's kind of jump in and see what Abraham does. I would suggest to you the type of lifestyle that we need to respond is this. We need to be willing to be displaced. When God calls your name, God calls us to himself, and ministry flows out of that. A lot of times when we think about a calling of God, we think about an occupation. But if I could ask you to just set aside that model for just a second, because if an occupation is all you're seeking, what happens if something in your life keeps you from performing that occupation? Does it shorten the calling? I would suggest to you that the calling of God, first of all, is to himself, and ministry flows out of that. But even more than that, I would suggest to you that purpose flows out of this, that an occupation cannot satisfy. Life flows out of the calling. Marital fulfillment flows from the calling when you pursue God first. And listen, I understand being married, it's just not all that simple, right? It can be complicated. Shake your head if you agree. It can be. So I know that in saying this, there's always more to the story. But listen, I've seen couples that just sharpened their faith in their pursuit with Jesus, and it fixed a whole lot. And I would just be willing to say, if you could do this one thing and check your relationship with Jesus, it's going to help you to get on the right path, to set the right trajectory for what happens next. From the calling of God. It's a lifelong calling. But you must exchange your slippers for walking shoes. And in case you haven't noticed, I got me some slippers. So I picked these slippers out for a reason. When I was a kid, I remember one Christmas, my mom got us these animal slippers, and I got bear ones, and like my brother got tiger ones, and then my oldest brother, he got like polar bear ones. And so my wife got me these slippers, and I wear them. I wear them all the time. I'm just gonna be honest, sometimes I'd just like to go out like to the mailbox and wear these just to keep people guessing. It's fun. But in the story of pursuing God, I want you to think about slippers as this moment of comfort. You can't do all that you need to do to pursue the promise and live a completely comfortable lifestyle. It will be work and it will be uncomfortable at times. Framing houses, I would never wear these when I'm framing a house. You need the right kind of shoes. And I brought some shoes with me. These are my work shoes, my walking shoes. So I thought I'd just exchange these out real quick. And so Abraham was called by God. And God called him and he said, I want you to get out of your country, your nation, your kindred, all of those things, and leave and follow into the place that I'm going to show you. What was he saying? Abraham, I want you to leave the place of comfort, your slippers, and put on some shoes, because I'm going to take you on a road trip and you're not coming back. I want you to leave your country, your familiarity, your culture, your everything, and I want to take you to somewhere where you haven't been yet. And that can only be done by putting on your walking shoes. You see, Abraham was what I would call an inverted prodigal. If you read the story of the prodigal son, the son comes into his dad and he says, give me my money, I want my inheritance, and he departs to leave his nation, his culture, his kindred for another country and joins himself to that. And Abraham does almost the exact same thing, except the difference is he followed God and allowed God to bring him comfort. They can be really close, but there's one really important difference. Whose voice are you following? And that's what Abraham did. God is wanting to help us to make a life. Come and follow me. Abraham, I have something to show you. It's not any different than when Jesus showed up to the day of the disciples and said, hey, come and follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. It's the same thing. That's what's happening in the story. But we have to choose to walk. And while we're walking on this road trip, this camping trip that he's journeying on, I want you to think travel trailers, not mobile homes. You know, there's a difference between a travel trailer and a mobile home. They sound the same, right? But you pull in to a mobile home park and you pull back the skirting underneath. A lot of those homes are sitting on blocks and the wheels are pulled off, tucked underneath. They look like they're ready to move, but the wheels are off. This morning, you look like you might be ready to move, but are your wheels off? You have to ask yourself that. If God were to call you, are you willing to go? You cannot receive the promise without putting on the shoes. Because he's going on this camping trip. And any campers in here? Like people go camping? There's a lot of reasons that we choose to go camping, right? The amenities, the places we go, the locations, like the people we see. I'm just curious in this place. Somebody shout, the farthest place you've been camping? Backyard, Wyoming. Colorado. That's as far as we got. Colorado. Florida. Okay, we're getting a little farther. There's campsites all over, right? And I'm just curious in here. Somebody who camps, hold up your hand. Okay, first one I saw. What's your favorite place to go back to camping? What's your top, number one? Florida. Camping site in Florida. Someone else, hold up your hand. What's your favorite spot? Anybody? No, I'm not. Florida's cool. I'm better than that. Favorite places to camp in Iowa? We got a place? Red Rock. Thomas Mitchell. Anybody been to any of those? Right? We go back to those places because of the places we like, the campsites we like, the amenities we have, the people that are there. Whatever reason, there's lots of reasons for us to go camping. And so Abraham is going on this lifelong camping trip, right? He leaves, he's left for Canaan, and he arrives there. And upon arriving, God makes a promise to him. He says, look at the land, all this. I'm going to bless you. And he says, and I will give this land to your offspring. This is the first time that he talks about that Abraham and his family can have kids. I'm going to bless you, and you're going to have a kid. And through your son, you'll bless all nations. It's the first time it's mentioned. And I would suggest to you, even in the calling that God might give you today or has given you, the promise is always bigger when you get there. There's always more to the story that you can't see in the waiting. And so Abraham built an altar, and he pitched his tent, and it was near Bethel. And this is going to be really important to think about as we go through the rest of the story. And this is the first time that we see him calling on the name of the Lord. God's speaking to him. Abraham responds. Abraham gets there, and he builds an altar, and he says, yes, Lord. Then he leaves there. He goes around, he looks around to the north and south, and he walks around the land that he's been given from God, and he comes back around full circle, and he plants near trees of Mamre. And he pitched his tent there, and he built his altar. This place, Mamre, is not very far from Bethel. They're really pretty close together. It's like he's coming back to this same campsite. This place of promise. In fact, it was one of his favorite places to come back to. Mamre is the same place that later on that God appears and says, in a year's time, you're going to have a child. Because he's reminding him all through the story of this great promise. But this is the place where the promise becomes more close, more of a reality. And this is the place that I think it was Abraham's favorite place to come back to, because it was a place that's kind of up on a hill that you could look over all of God's promise and see what he's given him. A place to just sit back and be like, man, God is great. He is awesome. How good is our God that he would entrust me with a promise like this? In fact, this place, this location, is the same location that he buried his wife and that he was buried in. He died overlooking the promise. He died in the place of promise. Listen, there are some promises that are worth coming back to. There are some promises that are worth circling back and reminding yourself again. There are promises that you need to take to your grave holding on, saying, God is great. That's what happens in the story. He's great. And I want you to think about this in this idea of leaving and moving toward God. I want you to think this idea of willing over ready. Now I know when you look at the New Testament, Jesus said, watch and be ready. And I'm really not talking about that kind of ready in the preparation. I'm just talking about a willingness to say yes when God calls. So 2 Fridays ago, I was watching Sing 2 with my family. It was like midnight. Anybody see Sing 2? Yeah. So my daughter wanted to watch it, so I watched it. So we got done watching that because her Fridays are layup, stay up night, she calls it. And so we stayed up late. It was about midnight. We just get done watching it. And we're done watching it. I'm getting ready to go to bed. And then my son's like, hey, can we watch something else now? It's Avery's turn. Now it's my turn. I was like, okay. So I'm checked out. I'm sitting in the chair, and I get a phone call. Hey, Pastor Justin, I have an emergency, and I need you to come if you would. And you know what? I said, give me 10 minutes, and I'll be there. And I got ready, and I got in my truck, and this is honestly what happened. Got in my truck, turned on the keys, and I'm like, Lord, I got nothing. I'm tired, but you know exactly what is needed in this moment, and I know that you'll walk me through whatever needs to happen from here forward. And I'm just saying to you, there are some things in life that will hit you that you just can't be ready for. Yeah, you prepare, you have the tools. I had tools. I've been to Bible college. I've been to pastoral training, all of the things. But listen, unless you say yes, those tools don't really mean a whole lot. And if you'll say yes to God with whatever He's asking for you, the sky is the limit. Number 2, we must be allowed to have our faith see beyond the snapshots. I read this article this week about a picture paradox. And this is what one commentator said about a picture. He said, you cannot hang an event on the wall, only a picture. It seems, however, with a photograph, we have indeed a paradox of an event that hangs on a wall. And so I brought with me a picture this morning of a snapshot. You've probably seen this one. Yeah. This is like the slapshot that was heard around the world. And so I wanted to bring this to you today for you to consider. And the reason why is because I have talked to so many people about this picture in conversation over the last few weeks, just listening. And it's amazing how many differences of thoughts and opinions people have about who was right and who was wrong and what transpired and was it faked and all of that. And honestly, I have no idea. I'm just showing you a picture. And the reason why I'm showing you a picture is because I want to show you this paradox. You cannot capture an event with a picture hanging on a wall. And yet that's what you're trying to capture in a picture, is a quick snapshot, a quick close and open of the shutter, and you have that. And we can say a whole lot about that. But the truth is, there's more to people's lives than just what we see in a snapshot. There is. There's more to your life, and there's more to our life. And we can't live our lives and how we look at each other and look at the snapshots of when we miss. Because there's more. And so the story of Abraham is also a story of snapshots. And here's what the snapshots of Abraham look like. Right after he got this original calling out, your son, your offspring is going to be a child of many nations, inheritance, and all of that. Shortly after that, he and his wife Abraham traveled to Egypt because of a severe famine. Not long after the calling. And while they get there, before he arrives, he tells his wife, because his wife, he says, is just beautiful, gorgeous. And he's like, I know that when we get there, they're going to kill me because you're gorgeous. And so I want you to tell them that you're my sister so that way, like, it'll be good with you and it'll be good for me. And that wasn't a good plan. But God saved him out of that plan. And that wasn't one of his finest snapshots. Yet God blessed him in spite of himself. Then we look later on, after he receives the promise of having this child, and it says this, that Abraham had a child with Sarah's handmaiden. He was rushing the promise. How many know that snapshot is not a good one? When you rush the promise and you circumvent the promise to try to get in front of God. That's what happened. It's a part of his story, right? And if we stopped in each one of these moments, we'd have a whole lot to say if we were living next to him, right? Now, I haven't said this yet, but this just reminded me. In case you think it's easy to be Abraham and to choose to get up and move, he was 75 years old when God called him. He had already had an established life, and God asked him to get up and move. And he's here in this moment, trusting God. He's afraid. He's trying to rush the promise. Now, fast forward about 20 years, 20 plus years. And we see Abraham in the kingdom of Abimelech. Years after the calling, right? He's seen God reinforce the promise over and over and over. He's went down and he's helped get his son or his nephew Lot back from other kings. He's done some pretty awesome things. And we're years later into the story, and here's what happens. They go down into this kingdom, and again, Sarah's almost in the 90s at this point. And again, he tells his wife, she's my sister. I'm her brother. Till God intervenes, tells Abimelech, he says, I'm going to kill you. Abimelech says, I had no idea. He's like, that's right. Because you said that, you're not in trouble. So Abimelech goes to Abraham and he says, what in the world? Why don't you just tell me? And Abimelech says, or Abraham says, I knew that in this place, you guys didn't fear God. So I was afraid. Now, I want to stop here just for a second because I think you really need to capture what is going on. Think about this. On the good side, I'm so glad that we can mess up in almost identically the same way and God still helps. Because that's what's happening in the story. In our mess up, God is there. But what kind of a person does this? What kind of a person who takes 300 of his most skilled men, goes into 2 other kingdoms to get his nephew back, but will not fight for his wife? Think about that. I bet you that made her feel good. What kind of person does that? A person who is fearful, who's irrationally fearful. He's not thinking straight. And there's moments in our life, these snapshot moments, where it just seems like there's things that are happening around us that are beyond our control, that fear sets in, irrational fear sets in, and that's what's happening in this story. He's afraid that he's going to die. It's about him. Now, I want to step back beyond this because this is just my observation. You're not going to find this in a commentary anywhere, at least that I've read. This is just what my feeling is about this. So, you can take it or leave it. But if you pull back from the snapshot by expanding it on both sides of this chapter, 2 chapters before, Abraham meets with God, he appears, and God says, in a year's time, you're going to have a child. I'm going to come back in a year, and you'll have a son. Right after this chapter, Isaac is born. So I'm thinking, when I'm reading this, if I'm Abraham, why am I so afraid? I know God's with me. I know I have skilled men. What is it that's driving this? I would suggest to you it's not too far reaching that in the mind of Abraham, I'm so close to the promise. And he feels like it's resting all on his shoulders. And he's afraid. Think about that. In this 1 year, Sarah is either about to get pregnant or she is pregnant. It doesn't say. And he's afraid because he knows these people around him don't fear God. And I'm just thinking in my mind, he's thinking, I've just got to make it to the promise. I'm so close. He's not thinking straight. But let's look at the long exposure. Long exposure in photography is when like the shutter speed closes really slow. Here's another picture of what that can look like. There's lots of stuff that are taking place in the background, but you only see this one piece in plain, sharp image in the front exposure. And I want to show you the long exposure of Abraham. It's in Hebrews chapter 11. In Hebrews chapter 11, it says this, by faith, Abraham, when he was called to go, he obeyed and he went. By faith, Sarah, even though she was barren beyond her proper age, was enabled to conceive a child because she considered him who had promised. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered Isaac up on the altar. He who had received the promises was ready to offer up his one and only son. You want to know why I think that's kind of cool? In the long exposure of things, it doesn't mention any of the mess ups. Sometimes we have to remember when we see people in snapshots, there's more to the story. And remember, there's more in the picture that we're not seeing. Abraham was a person of faith. And there was still story left to write. There's still story in our life, left to write. And that's what's happening here as we see this. The snapshots of our life might define our moment, but they don't have to define our life. Number 3, we must recognize the promise is greater. Greater than your questioning. We see right after we're now moving into this chapter where Isaac has been born, he is grown up, he's probably now somewhere in adolescence, it could be older. And in this whole process, there's 2 things I want you to see. Earlier in Abraham's life, when God promises what he's going to do, Abraham says, how can I know? How can I know that you're with me? And so God says, get the sacrifice, divide it up, and normally you would walk through the sacrifice together. But God comes down, puts Abraham asleep, walks through it on his own because he says, by myself I will swear I'm going to do this. I'm going to make this happen. Here's what he says. He swears by himself alone, and to your descendants I will give this land. From Egypt to the great river Euphrates, to the land of the Kenites, the Canaanites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Raphites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, the Jebusites, and a lot of other ites, I don't know. But those were all wicked people. And he's saying, I'm going to give you this land. God's promise is declaring victory over every difficulty that lays before you. He's not only bigger than the promise of that moment, but in the land that he's giving you, he's bigger than all of them. You going through difficulty today? The promise is bigger. There's a victory for you. And God isn't afraid to be bigger than your questions. He's also greater than our best intentions. And so, one of the things that I brought with me on this trip is my Bible. It's a good thing to bring with you. This Bible I got when I was ordained several years ago, and you can see that it's pretty worn. And so, when I'm looking at this Bible, one of the things that I noticed a few years back is in like the front of it, it says lifetime guarantee. And I'm thinking, it's old. Like this says lifetime guarantee. Call this number. 1-800-366-7788. So what did I do? I took them at their word and I called the number. And I dialed the number, and while I'm dialing the number, immediately somebody picks up and starts speaking Spanish. And I'm just telling you, I'm not fluent in Spanish, so the only thing that I can think to say is, I don't speak Spanish. And the person responds back, one moment, please hold. And I'm thinking, why didn't you just start there? So after a few moments of waiting, somebody gets on the line and says, U.S. Cellular Hotline, how can I help you? And I'm thinking, that's how God communicates with everybody, is the telephone company. This is amazing, people. I just learn stuff every day. So I realized really quickly that probably U.S. Cellular is not going to help me with my guarantee. So I did what every normal human being who's determined to get their Bible replaced. I got Google out and I started Googling. NavPress. They're responsible. They'll help me. So I looked online, tried to find NavPress, Googled it, got some number, and I called the number, and somebody answers, and I'm on the phone with them, and I said, hey, I got this Bible. It's a Message Bible. Here's the type of Bible it is, and it's got a lifetime guarantee, and I'm just calling to get my guarantee. Can you please help? So they're like, okay, well, what kind of Bible it is? So I explain. Oh, I'm sorry. We don't carry that Bible anymore. Are you serious? So, what does any good pastor do? When they're faced with difficult circumstances, I quoted them the Bible. And I opened my Bible and I said to them, lifetime guarantee. This Message Bible is manufactured to serve you for a lifetime. If at any time the binding fails because of manufacturing defects, or if it just wears out from use, you may return it for a free replacement. Call this number. And I said, yeah, I just read that to you. It says I get something in return. I'm sorry, we don't have it. There's just not really. I'm like, but it says it in my Bible. And I learned something really important. When NavPress fails you, there's always Amazon. No, that's not what I learned. Although that's what worked. I ended up getting my Bible replaced, and I had to pay for it again through Amazon. But some important truth that I learned here. Sometimes man makes the promises that they make with the best of intentions. They meant it when they wrote it, but they couldn't follow through on their promise. And that's why God did what he did when he put Abraham to sleep. Is because Abraham would have had the best of intentions to complete the promise, but the promise was bigger than him. And God wasn't going to rely on the promises of man, but on himself alone. It all doesn't fall on your shoulders. It's bigger than you. He is bigger. And he's greater than the promises that we're holding on to. This chapter that we're in now is the chapter where he's getting ready to sacrifice his son. God says, I want you to take your son up to the mountain. I want you to sacrifice him to me. Abraham responds, takes his son, they pack the wood, they pack the fire, and they're on their way out. And as they're on their way out, the son says, we have no sacrifice. And Abraham says, God will provide. So they get out there, and there's no sacrifice, there's just a son. Seeing that there's no other sacrifice, he binds up the child, lays him on the altar, and raises his knife to sacrifice his son at God's request. Now, I'm going to stop here just to make this point. This is not one of those things that is repeatable. Like, this is an overarching promise that is unique to Scripture. So I'm not saying to you that will never happen. God is never going to ask you to do that. But that being said, I don't know if I could do that. I'm just being honest. I mean, I've got kids. I have a firstborn. And I would never think in my head that I could do that. What kind of person is Abraham that he can take his son out there and put him on the altar and lay him before there and sacrifice him, be willing to? I think something's happened from the previous chapters that is now in this one. You see, it's one thing for Abraham to hear the promise. It's another thing for Abraham to believe the promise, and yet another thing to receive it in. He's holding the promise in his hands of his first son. 25 years later, his son was born. He's holding this promise. And how could he lay him at the altar? You know how he could do that? But he could recognize in this moment that God is greater than the promise. And he said, God will provide. He was trusting in God's provision over the promises that he had. And listen, when he did that, Hebrews tells us that because he had received in these promises, he had already reckoned his son dead, and therefore he was already brought back to life. And there was a ram hiding off into the bushes that God said, wait, Abraham, I have a sacrifice for you that's better. And he says, now I know you won't hold anything back from me. And listen, if you can get to the place where you say, God, I'm just trusting in your provision, that you're greater, even if you're holding the promise in your hand, a place that you felt like you've arrived at. And God is saying, I want you to lay that down and trust me for something better. There's something better around the corner, even if you can't see it. It's better. Have Pastor Nathan come back. So Pastor Nathan was sharing this morning about troubles and difficulty. And I don't know if you've ever been there, if you are there right now. But sometimes when you're in difficult places, you just aren't thinking straight, right? I've been there. When I wake up in the morning, I'm just telling you, people think I'm smiling and I'm cheerful and blessing everybody. But I get up in the morning and I'm not awake till I get a cup of coffee and I'm sitting down, right? It's going to take me some time. And so this morning, I'm waking up, getting my coffee, getting my frosted mini wheats. And while I'm pouring my frosted mini wheats, I'm not awake yet. It's not going good. Like the dog had peed on the floor in the middle of the night and I stepped in it, like letting her out in the morning. It's not been great morning, waking up. That wasn't the best part of waking up, I'm telling you. So I'm pouring my cereal and I put it back, and as I'm putting it back, I'm looking at the box and I'm like, the box on the top doesn't have no tab like to hold the lid shut. And I'm like, what kind of company doesn't give me a box with the lid that holds the lid shut? That's dumb. Then I realized the box was upside down. And you know what? The truth of the matter is, sometimes it's the way we look at life. We're frustrated with God saying why, and we're just looking at it completely in the wrong perspective. But he's got this. And so if you're here this morning, I just want you to think with me. If life has struck you with something you weren't ready for, be willing to walk through it anyway, because he'll guide you. You may not have been ready, but you can be willing, and he'll help you. If you're here this morning and you feel like the moment that you're living in, you're stuck in this snapshot of a mistake like Abraham, and you feel like it's not going to end, listen, God sees the bigger picture. You have to see the bigger picture of faith in your life and rise above. He has victory over all. And if you're struggling this morning to hold on to the promises, listen, he is greater. He's greater. With every head bowed and eyes closed really quick, just a personal time between you and God. If you're here this morning and any one of those things resonated with you, I want you to hold up your hand and say, that's me. I'm struggling in a snapshot. I'm struggling to be willing. I'm holding the promise. Listen, God will meet you where you are. He is closer than you think, and he will lead you through it because he is greater than the promise. He is the promise maker. And listen, I want to share this with you this morning. You can look back up real quick. Faith is not fixed behind you, but it's revealed by what you're saying is where you're heading. I want you to think about this. Here's what Hebrews said, following Abraham's life, all of that. It says, now those who say such things show that they are seeking a country of their own. For if they had been thinking of the country that they had left, they would have had opportunity to go back. But instead, they were looking for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to call them their God, for he has prepared a city for them. What is that even saying? It's saying the people that were talking about going back and had their eyes looking back, they went back and they would have gone back. But if you can start talking about things that are forward, things that are greater, things that are true, it will take you into the future. And do you know that is exactly what happened to the prodigal when he was at his lowest spot? He started saying, in my Father's house, there's a place for me. And listen, I'm just telling you what, this morning, there's most definitely a place for you at your lowest. You just need to start saying and start talking over your life that there's a place for me in God that is greater than this moment. There's a better place for me than what's happening in this snapshot. There's a place for me that I know that if I'm willing to step out by faith, that he will meet me. Because he's greater. He's greater. And so this morning, if you'll stand with me right now as we worship, whatever it is that you're bringing with you this morning as we worship, make your prayer to him this morning, your confession this morning to say, God, I'm laying it at your feet. I'm willing, I'm trusting because you're greater. Come on, let's do that.